In the early stages of the North African campaign, long before the world understood what the United States was capable of on a battlefield, the Axis generals looked at the arrival of the U.S. 1st Armored Division with thinly disguised contempt. They viewed the American M3 Lees and the early M4 Shermans as crude machines, tall silhouettes on the dunes just waiting to be destroyed. In their arrogance, the Axis generals dismissed the U.S. Armored Division as an afterthought, but the desert would soon betray their confidence. The 1st Armored Division arrived, not with swagger or pride, but with a quiet determination born from the industrial heart of America. But to prove that no dictatorship could dominate the world through fear, when the American tanks rolled off the ships and sank their treads into the scorching sand, they did so with the weight of a nation behind them. The desert greeted them with hostility. The sun seared their skin, the sand infiltrated every crease of their uniforms, and the nights were cold enough to make metal shrink and crack. But day after day, the American crews adapted. Their machines became their lifelines. They learned to adjust to the desert's unpredictability, to the way the sand softened beneath the weight of a tank, to the blowback of dust that blinded gunners and clogged rifles. Over time, the 1st Armored Division developed something the Axis never expected: resilience. And resilience, in war, is often more powerful than experience. When the inevitable clash between the Americans and the Afrika Korps approached, the desert seemed to hold its breath. German scouts observed the American tanks advancing in the distance and saw nothing threatening. They reported slow, clumsy formations. They predicted another easy victory. Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, believed he would teach the Americans a painful lesson about armored warfare, but what he didn't understand was that the Americans had studied him, his patterns, his rhythm, his reliance on mobility, his use of flanking maneuvers, and his dependence on supply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles. What Rommel considered strengths, the Americans saw as vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. The battle began at dawn. The sky shifted from deep blue to a fierce orange as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the dunes. The American tanks appeared like metallic silhouettes moving with slow, deliberate purpose. Inside each Sherman and M3 Lee, the crews whispered short commands, checking instruments, loading shells, steadying their nerves. Then, in the far distance, columns of dust rose into the air, the unmistakable sign of approaching German armor. The Panzer Division advanced confidently, their engines roaring across the sand. They believed they were about to crush the newcomers, but the Americans had something the Germans didn't: an endless will to keep moving forward. The first exchange was brutal. German gunners struck early, destroying several American tanks with precise fire. Flames erupted, metal buckled, and smoke streaked into the sky. In any other theater of war, such losses might have shattered morale, but the Americans didn't break. They didn't stop. They pushed forward, tank after tank, formation after formation, absorbing the blows and answering them with their own fire. For every Sherman that burned, another emerged from behind a dune. For every M3 Lee that fell silent, two more rolled forward to take its place. This relentless pressure shocked the Germans. They were accustomed to enemies who retreated under fire, who scattered when the Panzer divisions attacked. But the Americans advanced as if the desert belonged to them. Their artillery found its mark, shaking the ground beneath the Axis tanks. German crews inside their panzers felt the earth tremble as shells landed closer and closer. Then, for the first time in the Desert War, the German commanders realized something unsettling. The Americans were not fighting by the old rules. They weren't maneuvering like the British. They weren't breaking under fire like other armies. They were pushing forward with a resolve that defied logic. As the fighting intensified, the desert turned into a furnace of exploding shells, twisting metal, and pillars of fire. Panzer after panzer was hit, their hulls engulfed in flames. Some tried to retreat, but the Americans had anticipated that too, cutting off escape routes with flanking movements of their own. The Germans found themselves trapped between dunes that offered no cover. The desert, once the proud domain of Rommel's armored forces, was being reshaped by the relentless American advance. The desert floor became a graveyard of burned-out panzers, twisted turrets, and shattered treads. Every wrecked vehicle was a monument to the arrogance that had blinded the access to the truth. The Americans were not just present in the desert, they were taking it. The deeper the Americans pushed into the dunes, the clearer it became that the battle had shifted entirely. What began as a clash of armored formations had transformed into a collapse, slow at first, then sudden, violent, and absolute. German tank commanders who once carried themselves with confidence now felt the tremor of panic creeping up their spines. They issued orders that were drowned out by the roar of explosions. Their positions, meticulously planned, now cracked under the weight of a force that refused to break, refused to back down, refused to behave like any army the Afrika Korps had ever faced. The panzer divisions, once symbols of German dominance, found themselves overwhelmed. They were faster, yes, they were often more precise, but they were few, and in the desert, numbers mattered. Endurance mattered, supply mattered, and the Americans had arrived with more of all three than Rommel could ever hope to match. As the morning stretched into midday, the temperature soared. The desert felt like a furnace, the sun hammered down from above, each ray like a blow against metal, heating the tanks until the interiors felt like ovens. German crews suffocated in the heat, sweat stinging their eyes, uniforms sticking to their bodies. Their engines sputtered, their ammunition dwindled, their radios crackled with frantic chatter. Meanwhile, the Americans, hot, exhausted, and battered, kept moving. They moved not because their tanks were superior, but because they had been given an order and they intended to complete it no matter the cost. The Sherman crews pushed their machines to the limit, grinding their treads through the sand, ignoring the blasts around them, communicating with short, urgent commands. Those men, many only in their early 20s, fought as if the entire war depended on their advance. And in a way it did. The pivotal moment came shortly after noon, when a German armored column attempted a counter-offensive. It was their last calculated attempt to break the American line. Dust rose behind the panzers as they accelerated, engines screaming, turrets facing forward. It was a desperate charge, reminiscent of earlier victories that had defined the Afrika Korps. But as they crested a dune, prepared to strike the center of the American formation, they were met with a sight they had not anticipated. A full American artillery battery already positioned and waiting. The desert erupted. Shells rained down with terrifying accuracy, tearing open the panzers like tin cans. Metal flew in every direction. Flames burst from ruptured fuel lines. German tank crews tried to maneuver, but the blast zone erased any sense of direction. It was chaos, pure, concentrated destruction. American gunners worked as if possessed, shouting coordinates, adjusting angles, firing again and again. The German counterattack collapsed in minutes. Smoke and fire climbed into the sky, forming pillars so dark they cast shadows across the sand. It was in that moment, amid the deafening artillery barrages, that the morale of the Afrika Korps finally broke. Some German crews abandoned their tanks entirely, sprinting across the desert in a futile attempt to escape. Others stayed inside, refusing to leave their vehicles even as flames licked through the hatches. Officers yelled for their men to hold the line, but their voices no longer carried authoritative desperation. The Americans saw the break, and they pressed harder. Shermans rolled forward through the smoke, emerging like ghosts of steel. Their turrets swung, their guns fired, and more panzers erupted in fire. The sun glared off the American tanks, giving them an almost mythical glow. One German officer would later describe the scene as the moment the desert itself rose against us. For the Axis troops who survived, it was a memory that seared itself into their minds permanently. As the German line crumbled, the desert grew eerily quiet. The thunder of battle faded into the distance. The wind returned, sweeping across the dunes, carrying with it the smell of burning fuel and scorched metal. The landscape was now a sprawling graveyard of destroyed armor panzer turrets, blown open, tracks twisted and broken, entire hulls melted into the sand. The first armored division emerged from the smoke, battered, dust-covered, and exhausted, but victorious beyond measure. The men inside those tanks had witnessed something extraordinary. The collapse of a force the world had once believed unbeatable. They had endured the brutality of desert warfare, faced the legendary Afrika Korps head-on, and proven that the American spirit when tested was a force no army could ignore. Reports of the victory spread quickly. American commanders were stunned by the scale of the success. British forces, who had fought Rommel for years, were astonished at the ferocity and resolve the Americans displayed. Even Roosevelt was briefed with unusual urgency. The president was told that the United States had not only held its ground in the desert, it had shattered the myth of German armored invincibility. Meanwhile, in the Axis high command, disbelief turned to quiet dread. Rommel read the reports with a heavy silence. He understood better than anyone that the desert had shifted. His forces were no longer facing an inexperienced opponent. They were facing a new kind of army, one that absorbed punishment and kept advancing, one supported by a nation whose industrial output dwarfed anything. Germany could produce one filled with young men who fought with a sense of purpose that no ideology could crush. The words Rommel reportedly muttered to his staff summed up the turning tide of the war. We underestimated them, and the truth was undeniable. The Americans had not just participated in the battle, they had transformed it. The 1st Armored Division had arrived in North Africa as an afterthought, dismissed by enemy commanders, overshadowed by British and German legends. But now, they stood as the force that had shaken the desert to its core. In the days that followed, reconnaissance flights captured images of the battlefield. Analysts were stunned. Tank after tank lay overturned or burned out. The positions the Germans once held with pride had been abandoned in chaos, and the tracks of American armor carved deep scars across the sand, marking not just a path of movement, but a path of victory. The desert would remember, and so would history. Swallowed by the very desert. They thought they ruled, undone by an enemy they never should have underestimated.